You can raise bees in your garden, and it doesn't involve getting stung or wearing a white suit. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today's topic is a bee hotel. A bee hotel can serve as a home for dozens of species of bees, and those bees can be very helpful in your garden. Let's begin by discussing bees. When you think of bees, you're probably thinking of honey bees. You're thinking of hives with thousands of bees that live there making honey. But that's not the type of bee that will be using our bee hotel. In the United States, there's about 4,000 species of bees, and less than 1% are honeybees. In the United Kingdom, there's about 200 species of bees, and only one of them is a honeybee. So the vast majority of bees are not honeybees. In fact, they're called solitary bees because instead of a big hive that they live in, there are individual females that will lay the eggs for the next generation. And by itself, that female needs to find a nest. It needs to find a place to lay its eggs. That's what we're doing. We're just providing a location for some of those solitary bees to lay an egg and raise the next generation. A lot of the information that I'll be referencing comes from The Bees in Your Backyard. This is a wonderful book, and I'll put a link to it below. In this book, you can discover the many reasons why solitary bees are so amazing for the garden. They are incredible pollinators. The red mason bee, for example, is 120 times more effective at pollinating than a honeybee. Honeybees have pollen pockets, and so they'll stuff it full of pollen, fly back to the hive, and take their time while that pollen is distributed. Well, solitary bees don't have pollen pockets. Their body is not that effective at holding pollen. So they'll fly to a flower, get some pollen, fly to another flower, and in the meantime, a lot of that pollen falls off. So they have to keep repeating that process from flower to flower to get enough pollen to bring back to their nest. And the male solitary bee doesn't need to go back to the nest at all. So all it does is fly from flower to flower, getting enough pollen for it to eat until eventually it dies. But in the process, it's pollinating thousands of flowers. Of those many species of solitary bees, about 70% of them make a nest in the ground. They might burrow or find a spot under a log or a rock, but it's low in the ground. The type of bee that we're most focused on is that other 30%. And those are the solitary bees that like to make their nest in an old log or a wall where there's a hole. So what we'll be doing to make our bee hotel is just providing a whole bunch of holes so that these female solitary bees can find it and make it their home. We're talking about bees like mason bees and leafcutter bees. And in my garden last year, I kept finding the leaves with little circles cut out of them. You may have seen that in your garden as well. Well, those are leafcutter bees that are cutting the holes out of the leaves to put into their nest. Here's how it works. When that female solitary bee finds a hole, it'll come to the very back and it'll drop off a ball of pollen and nectar. And then it'll lay an egg and seal off that compartment. Might use mud, or in the case of the leafcutter bee, it'll use leaves to make this wall. Then it'll go back out to the flowers and collect more pollen and nectar, make another food source for the egg, and then block it off. And it'll continue doing this, adding pollen and nectar and laying an egg and pollen and nectar and laying an egg. And when it gets to the entrance, it'll block off the entrance. What's so amazing is that this last egg is most likely going to be a female, and each of these other eggs will be a male. And so the egg will hatch, a larva will come out, the larva will spin a cocoon and become a bee as it begins growing within this cocoon. And that pollen and nectar was the food source to provide the energy for it to develop into a bee. As the weather warms up in the spring, this first bee will break through or eat through this entrance and exit, followed by this bee. And each of the bees will exit out the hive that this solitary bee has essentially created. These will all be the males, so they'll hang out until this last bee exits, and this female is ready for these males to impregnate and set up the process again. And this female will begin looking for a hole of its own to start this process again. I find that whole cycle just absolutely amazing. What we want to do with our bee hotel is create those holes so that those solitary bees can find a place to lay eggs. And because of the many species out there, we're talking about bees of many different sizes. Some of those really small flies that you think are in your garden, well, they're probably bees. So we've got very tiny bees, and we've actually got some pretty big bees. So the holes that we'll be providing in our bee hotel will range from about 1/8 inch diameter up to about 3/8 inch diameter. Now, you'll see lots of different recommendations. I've seen everything from 2 millimeters to 10 millimeters as a suggestion for how big the hole needs to be. It depends on the bees, what kind of bees you have. So until you know what kind of bee you have, I suggest making holes of all different sizes. Those smaller holes, say a 1/8 inch diameter, needs to only be 3 or 4 inches deep. But a hole that's a 3/8 inch diameter, much wider, it may need to go 4 to 6 inches deep, because the bees are going to be laying a number of eggs, and that last egg will be a female. If the hole isn't deep enough, well, then the female bee is only going to lay male eggs. That's another part of the process that's just mind-blowing. The size of your bee hotel is completely up to you, and how fancy it is completely up to you. I'll be showing you how to make a pretty rustic bee hotel, but I have a friend, Terry, who makes some gorgeous bee hotels. They're wonderfully cut and decorated. She'll even put copper strips at the top as a decorative component. They work, and they're really nice to look at. My bee hotel is not so fancy. It's pretty basic, but it still does the job. This project begins by just building a box. We need to put some individual pieces inside. This is where the bees will reside. You can build the box out of just about anything. I think it's ideal for scrap wood. If you want a fancy bee hotel like the ones that Terry makes, then buy new wood and you can paint it or stain it. But for me, I'm just reusing some cedar fence boards from a fence that blew down in a storm. I took 2 pieces of these boards and then attached them at the end with little 2x3 pieces. This box is 18 inches high and 24 inches wide. As I got more pieces for the different sides, I just kept attaching them at the corners. Now you could use nails, but because this is going outside, there's a real good chance the nails can pull out or the wood can split. So I like to use screws to attach the wood to these corner support pieces. And after the frame of the box is complete, I then attached a piece of plywood to the back. Now it's just a scrap piece of plywood cut to 2 feet by 18 inches. The two fence pieces together are about 10.5 inches, which is perfect because I want the depth of each of these holes to be between about 4 and 6 inches. So each of these logs is cut to about 8 inches. These 8-inch logs sitting with a 10.5-inch top and sides give me about 2 to 2.5 inches of overhang and protection from wind and weather on all sides. I recently cut down a tree, so I had a lot of branches and logs that I could use for this project. And I just took those branches and using a saw cut them into 8-inch lengths. I have these branches and logs to use to make this bee hotel, but you can use just about any wood that you have lying around. If you've got some extra pieces of 4x4s, go ahead and cut them to the appropriate depth and you could use them. Now, I do not recommend that you use pressure treated wood because it does have chemicals in it that can harm the bees. So as long as it's wood that's not been treated, go ahead and use it to make this hotel. And you don't have to have big solid pieces of wood. You can just take a number of twigs, bind them together in little bundles, and put them into the hotel as well. After all the wood is cut, I just stack it into the box, trying to get as little space as possible between each piece. Little ones on top of big ones, on top of other big ones. Finish stacking and fill up the box as much as you can, but do be aware of how heavy it's going to be after all of the wood is in place. I leave space between the top logs and the top of the box so that I can get in here and use some screws for mounting to a post later on. The bee hotel consists of a number of different size logs, all with different size holes drilled into them. The drill bits need to be long enough to get the complete depth that you're looking for. For these smaller bits, I'll actually put a piece of tape at about the 4-inch point to give me an idea when I get close to that depth. And for these bigger bits, I'll put a piece of tape at the 6-inch mark. I don't yet know what kind of bees I have in my garden, so I've created a lot of variety. I've got big holes and little holes drilled to different depths so that when any bee in my garden discovers this bee hotel, hopefully they'll find a room that they want to move into. It's pretty cold and snowy outside in my garden right now, but when it warms up here in a little bit, this is ready to go outside. I'm planning on attaching it to a post, but I could just as easily attach it to a tree or stack it on rocks or blocks just to get it off the ground, because I don't want rain splashing onto these holes or snow rising up and covering any of it. So it should be at least a couple feet off the ground. 3 feet or a meter high is ideal. That helps keep it out of the weather, and it really helps the bees survive. This is a good project that you should consider for your garden. It's easy, and you can just use the scrap wood you have lying around. If you have any questions about it, please let me know in the comments below. If you want to see more gardening videos, well, then subscribe to the GardenerScott channel, and be sure to click on the bell so you know when the new videos are coming out every week. If you like this video, well, then give me a thumbs up and share it. I'm GardenerScott. Enjoy gardening.